Okay. The quantity of money equation. This is some measure of money. M1, M2. We're going to, as economists, we're going to use M2, but M is money. Not imports, as we would have had on the circular flow. Okay, so this is actually using, it's money. This is something, so that's money. Okay. This is something called velocity, which is basically how many times the money is spent. And there's a lot of, we haven't decided yet whether velocity changes, although the majority of economists at this point say velocity changes with the economy. Think of it this way. When the economy's hot, we start spending more and faster for a lot of reasons. One thing is that tends to cause sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're all doing well, we all got jobs, we spend money faster, and this tends to drive up prices. But think of it as if there was a tennis ball, actually racquetball, one of those blue racquetballs, bouncing around the rooms of the classroom, and every time it bounces, somebody spent it. The velocity of money is how many times GDP was actually spent, how many times the money that was equal to the GDP was actually spent. So how many times does our money get spent? If nobody's working, everybody's out of work, you've got a job and you've got a little bit of money, are you as likely to spend it as you would be if everybody was working, things are cool, no problems, we expect no problems ever? Right. So most of us tend to think that the rate we spend the money is variable. Although if you read an old textbook, they'll tell you it's fixed. Okay? Now, this is nominal GDP. The Y is real GDP. And this is the price level as in CPI. So it's the CPI, it's the price level as we would describe it as the CPI. So we have this situation where the amount of money can have an impact. For example, if we wanted money by itself, do a little algebra, right? You get money by itself, then you're going to have to take the V and divide it on both sides, right? PY over V will give us the nominal level of GDP. And we have to divide that by the number of times it's spent to figure this out. It would be so easy if velocity was always, say, 6, which it often is somewhere around 6 in a normal economy. But when you go into the Great Depression, it might fall and it might take more money. Or the Great Recession, where the Fed was dumping money into the economy. And everybody said, oh, we're going to have inflation, we're going to have inflation. And we didn't have that much inflation. But a lot of people weren't spending their money. So you could say, okay, you've got some nominal amount of GDP, which is the price level times the real GDP. And so the money will be the nominal amount of GDP divided by how many times it's spent. So money can have an effect on the economy. The thing about money, though, is that it doesn't seem to have much impact. It takes a lot of it, and it doesn't seem to have much impact during something called a liquidity trap. So let me introduce you to something called aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so let's see, price and quantity. There's supply, and then there's the supply for the whole country. And there's demand, and there's the supply for the whole country, and I mean for everything. So when we're talking about the whole country, we use the word aggregate. And so aggregate supply tends to look like this in the long run. So it doesn't just go like that. It tends to be very flat and then reach a point where it starts to go up, and eventually you basically run out of stuff you can't produce anymore. And by the way, we don't put Q, we put Y here. Okay, so isn't that a nice vertical line? So we have this, let's see if I can do a better job. This level of output that would be determined by the amount of resources that we have. Do you remember PPC? Do you remember that, the production possibilities frontier, PPF, I guess is what your textbook was calling it. And you had guns versus butter. And sometimes you could not, there were points you could not reach right now because resources, technology, etc. were fixed at a point in time. Well, we're in this position with our supply. There's only so much stuff we can produce given our resources, given our technology, given the current political environment towards business taxes, regulations, that sort of thing. So we reach that, and you just can't produce any more. So basically, when you're way out here, moving the demand curve only results in the prices going up. So the prices are going up along this axis, but you can't go any farther that way in the long run. There's a short run where you can temporarily deceive workers, but then they figure it out, demand pay raises, and we just sort of ratchet up. But basically, when you're here, this is not a good, you can't move beyond that point in the long run until you get more resources or more technology, etc. So if this was aggregate demand, the Fed could use money to keep inflation down by shrinking money, and when you're in this range, we could increase the money and move aggregate demand out. And I can talk more about that too. But the Fed tends to work in this zone. So they can move aggregate demand out, but then there's this area that we call the liquidity trap, which we were in. We got stuck in a liquidity trap in 2008 when everything collapsed, and the markets were so bad. The markets were bad. There was a lot of propaganda saying that the economy was great, but those of us that lived it know better, and the economists know better. So if it happens that you're here in this flat area, this flat zone, this means we have so many laid off resources, so many people out of work, so many factories closed, shut down temporarily, that monetary policy doesn't work. You can pump out lots of money from the Fed, and it's not going to revive anything. It might be able to possibly stop things from getting horribly worse if there's something you're trying to offset. But in the general, it's called a liquidity trap. And that happens when you put out so much money that the interest rate, actually the real rate of interest, gets so low because basically it's when there's more money, when money goes up, interest rates tend to fall, ceteris paribus. I hope you can see that. When money goes up, interest percentages tend to fall. So we get to the point where the interest rate gets so low that after inflation, it's actually negative. And so Federal Reserve can act here, but when we get over here, you get negative interest rates, which means you've fallen into a liquidity trap where all the incentives are wrong. Because, well, I gotta watch the time. I've got a meeting in a few minutes, so let me just give you bits of this, and maybe we can talk about it in class some too. The nominal rate of interest, which just means that's the percentage, like if you say, you go to the bank and you say, I want to borrow money, I want to buy a car, and they tell you the nominal rate of interest, and that's what you would have to pay. So let's say that they say 8%. That's going to be made up of the real risk-free rate plus an inflation premium plus a risk premium plus something called a maturity premium and that has to do with long-term securities like long-term securities. I've got people knocking, they want to come in this door for a class, so I better finish this up. You won't worry about this to get to finance. It's just that the longer the security, if it's a 60-year loan, it's going to be riskier to the person who makes the loan. Risk premium, the less they think you're likely to pay it back, the higher your interest rate. I can guarantee you that someone like me that has paid their bills for decades and decades, always pay my bills on time, have a great credit rating, I'm going to get a lower car loan than, say, a college student who's got a bad credit record that hasn't paid their bills. I'm talking about someone who hasn't paid their bills. You haven't paid your bills, you got a bad credit rating. They're gonna add some. So let's say they add 2% there. The inflation premium they think is going to be, let's say they think it's going to be 3%, and because they want to get their money back if there's inflation, and then whatever's left is the real risk-free rate. But we've always said that the U.S. government borrows at the risk-free rate. So what if the nominal rate is 1% and we're expecting 2% inflation? And it's the U.S. government's lowest risk, the shortest term bill. So the only thing you have, if we assume the government is risk-free when they borrow, which nowadays we're beginning to wonder, okay? If you assume that, then this one must be minus 1%. And we're in a liquidity trap when that happens. And we were. I've got to get out of this classroom because there's a class coming in.